November in North Korea did not arrive like a change of season. It arrived like a sentence being carried out. Cold did not just press against the soldiers on the ridge above the river. It got inside them. It slid through wool and cotton, through fatigues and skin, until it found bone and wrapped itself there like a second marrow. Metal turned against the hands that held it. Rifle stocks burned with frost through gloves soaked in melted snow. Breath left mouths as white smoke that froze into beards and eyelashes and made faces look older than they were. Corporal James Kim dug the heels of his boots into the crusted snow and felt it crack in a thin, brittle line. The sound was swallowed almost at once by the wind. His toes had been numb long enough that he had forgotten exactly when they had stopped hurting. His fingers had gone from pain to a heavy, frightening absence, as if the ends of his hands had simply fallen away in the dark. This was not the winter his parents had described when they talked about the place they had left behind. In Sacramento, winter had been a season of rain and fog. It had meant streets that shone under the yellow lights of the grocery store, puddles that cars turned into brief fountains, damp wool coats hanging over the back door. His earliest memories were of the small kitchen behind the store, of steam rising from pots, of his mother's voice moving awkwardly between Korean and English as she called him to dinner, while his father tallied numbers in a worn ledger. His parents' Korea had existed in fragments of story. Nights when someone might knock on the door and change everything. Lines for rice that ran out before they reached the front. Landlords who took more than they were owed. Soldiers who were not there to protect. Hunger that lived not only in the stomach, but in the mind. They never called that place home. Home was the store with the cracked linoleum floor and the bell over the door that rang every time a customer came in. Now he stood on a ridge in a country his parents had fled, wearing a uniform of the country they had chosen, looking at a river that had been a thick blue line on a map and was now a hard, glittering band of ice somewhere beyond the hills. The officers had told them that this was almost the end. The map in the command tent had been neat and clean, blue arrows sweeping north, a thin red line pushed back against the water. One more offensive, they had said, and the enemy would be trapped. One more push, and they would be home by Christmas. The enemy was exhausted. The enemy was broken. The enemy had nothing left to throw. The first sign that this was wrong came not from the ground in front of them, but from the air. It began as a thin, wavering note drifting over the ridge from the darkness beyond their lines. For a moment, James thought it might be the wind catching some piece of loose metal. Then another note joined it. Then another. Within a minute, the sky above the ridge was full of sound. Dozens of notes, then hundreds, high and piercing, rising and falling in patterns that did not belong to any drill field he had ever stood on. Bugles, not the sharp, clean calls he had learned in training, not the regulated signals that told men when to rise, when to fall in, when to advance. These were longer, wilder phrases designed not to carry orders, but to get inside a man's chest and set his heart beating out of rhythm. The sound came from everywhere at once, echoing off the hills, bouncing in the hollows, blending with the wind, until it felt as if the earth itself was making that noise. Along the line, helmets turned. Men lifted their heads above the shallow foxholes they had chipped into the frozen ground. They squinted into the black beyond their arcs of fire, as if staring hard enough could force shapes out of the dark. For one suspended moment, the entire ridge seemed to inhale. The mortar that hit nearest James landed 30 yards to his right. The blast picked him up and threw him sideways like a child's toy. The world went white. Sound crushed itself into a single painful whine that filled his skull, pushing out everything else. Dirt and ice and pieces of things he did not want to identify rained down on him. Something heavy struck his shoulder and rolled away. When his vision stopped flickering, he realized that he was on his back in the bottom of his foxhole, staring up at a sky that had gone from black to a flat, dirty gray. Snowflakes drifted down through the smoke. His mouth was full of soil. He spat and saw that the mud had a darker color in it. He did not want to think about what that meant. He rolled to his knees and pulled himself up on the lip of the hole. The tidy line of positions he had seen at dusk had been replaced by a landscape of craters and torn earth. Some foxholes were deeper now because the mortar blasts had carved them deeper. Some were simply gone. In their place were shapes that did not move. The bugles were still sounding. Under them, another sound had begun, a low, rolling roar like surf. He saw them then. They crested the far ridge in a line that made his brain stall for a second. Human shapes, but too many of them, too close together. Dark figures against the snow, padded jackets making their bodies look wide, almost swollen. They moved with a rapid, steady step that covered ground frighteningly fast. There were no neat gaps between them, no comfortable spaces where a man could imagine a bullet passing without finding a target. The bugles screamed above them. Voices rose in shouts that might have been words, or might have been pure sound. They were not advancing as squads. They were advancing as a wave. Training came back, not as a thought, but as a reflex. James brought his rifle to his shoulder. The stock bit into his coat. He sighted on the center of the blur and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. Somewhere in that mass, a figure jerked and went down. Another stepped into the space he had occupied. James fired again. He lost the individual impact of shots almost at once. The report of his rifle merged into a greater noise. He worked the action without thinking, feeding clips into the weapon with fingers that did not want to obey him anymore. To his left, a machine gun stuttered in short, controlled bursts, the kind of textbook fire he had heard on the range, meant to conserve ammunition and maintain accuracy. The gun chewed a narrow path into the oncoming line. Men fell, others tripped over them and kept going. The bursts stopped. There was no call for more ammo. There was only the continuing howl of the bugles. The manuals the instructors at Fort Benning had given them had described how a line behaved under pressure. It bent. It regrouped. It fell back in an orderly fashion to secondary positions. There were diagrams for it, arrows and lines and shaded areas. The manuals had not described what happened when a line was hit not by a measured push, but by a flood. Around James, men stopped being a line and became individuals making choices. Some fired until their rifles clicked on empty chambers, then fumbled for ammunition they could not feel. Some understood without being told that staying on the ridge meant being overrun. They began to scramble out of their holes, crouching low, trying to move back along the slope. There were no shouted commands. The radios that might have carried those were either in pieces or in hands that no longer worked. James had just slammed another clip into his rifle when the blast that changed everything hit behind him. He did not see the shell. He felt the air punch him forward. The ground rose up and hit him hard enough to knock the breath out of his lungs. The rifle flew from his hands. His helmet spun away. For a second, he was looking at the world sideways. Snow and mud and something bright that his mind refused to label slid past his face. He tried to get up. A boot came down on the back of his neck, driving his face into the snow. The sudden shocking cold against his cheek barely registered under the weight on his spine. Someone grabbed his arms and wrenched them backward. The movement was not careful. His shoulders screamed. He felt his chest compress further against the ground. Something thin and sharp wrapped around his wrists. The first twist bit through his gloves. The second twist cut into flesh. The pain was immediate and electric. A bright line that shot up through his arms into his skull. He heard the sound he made. A short, ugly noise pushed out of him. Wire. Not rope that would bite and burn. Not handcuffs that would bruise and pinch. Wire that cut because cutting was what it had been made to do. He tried to turn his head. The boot on his neck shifted just enough to let him roll his face to the side. Snow stuck to his skin. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a leg in quilted trousers, the dark barrel of a rifle, the flash of a bayonet. The point hovered 6 inches from his throat. The metal looked clean and absurdly shiny in the gray light. There was a tiny chip on the edge where it had struck something hard in some other place, on some other day. He had wondered, at odd times, what would go through his mind if he ever found himself about to die in battle. He had imagined courage, pride, a kind of solemn acceptance, a sense of exchanging his own life for something larger and more lasting. Instead, what came now was a memory of his mother standing at the sink after closing the store, washing dishes with her sleeves rolled up, water up to her wrists, telling him in Korean that he needed to eat more because he was getting too thin. He thought, in one brief, vicious flash, that if the bayonet went in, the postcard she had sent him would stop its journey with him. It was in his left breast pocket, warm against his skin. On the front, an orange grove under a bright California sky. On the back, 4 lines in careful English about burning the rice while she had been thinking of him, and 1 word in Korean she had written without noticing. the one that meant it is time to wake up. The bayonet did not move forward. The boot lifted from his neck. Hands still gripped his arms, but they shifted, hauling him up rather than pinning him down. The man above him said something sharp and quick in Mandarin, the words too fast and too unfamiliar for James to catch more than a fragment. The tone was annoyed, not angry. He might have been talking about a piece of equipment that had turned out to be more trouble than it was worth, but could not simply be thrown away. The wire bit deeper as his weight came onto his arms. He felt the skin tear. Warmth slid over his hands inside the gloves. The warmth turned cold almost at once in the air. The difference between a man and a prisoner turned out to be very small. A weapon taken away, a length of metal twisted around bone, the knowledge that whatever happened next would happen because someone else had decided it. They herded the survivors together in a hollow behind the ridge, a place that had been a resupply point the night before. Now it was a holding pen for the ones the blast had not taken. Men from his own regiment, men from other units, faces he knew by name, faces he had seen around campfires and mess lines, faces he had never noticed before and would now not forget. Private Anderson was there, the kid from Baker Company who had once tried to trade a week's worth of cigarettes for a single can of peaches. His left arm hung at a wrong angle, the bone having decided that the inside of the skin was no longer where it was supposed to live. Dunn, the radio operator, still had his headset around his neck, the cord trailing off and disappearing into the snow, as if it still connected to something that could help. There were gaps in the crowd where other men should have been. Sergeant Lewis, who had shown James on a hot afternoon how to shave seconds off his time when digging in, was not among the living. He was out on the slope now, horizontal, already starting to be covered by the same snow that had hidden them when the night had been quiet. The guards moved along the edges of the group, rifles held in hands that looked steady. They did not shout. They prodded when someone lingered. When one man stumbled and stayed down, another guard stepped up behind him, put the muzzle of his rifle to the back of the man's head, and fired. The sound was oddly flat at that range. The body jerked once and then went still. No one moved to help. No one closed the dead man's eyes. A minute later, when the column began to move, the line flowed around him. Within 10 steps, he was just another dark shape in the snow behind them. They marched south, away from the river that had been their objective, away from the lines on the map, away from anything that had made sense. The path was narrow in places, hugging the sides of hills that fell away into deeper valleys. The wind funneled up from below, cutting through coats and flesh without caring who wore which uniform. The wire around James's wrists had been twisted so tight that by midday he could no longer feel his hands. The first stage had been pain, a bright, insistent signal that demanded attention. The second stage was worse, numbness, as if his fingers had been cut off, leaving only the memory of their shape. The gloves hid the damage from his sight. His imagination did the rest. Once, when a man in front of him slowed, James tried to steady him with a touch of his bound hands between the man's shoulder blades. A guard appeared at his side almost instantly. The butt of the rifle slammed into James's ribs. The pain was so sharp and sudden that he tasted iron. He doubled over, fighting for breath, the wire biting deeper as his weight pulled against it. Helping, he realized, was a luxury the guards did not intend to allow. In Sacramento, his mother had wrapped his scarf around his neck too tightly on winter mornings, double and triple knots that he had complained about until she laughed and loosened them. Her fear then had been of colds and flus carried on playground hands. Here, the air itself was an enemy that did not care if he covered his throat. By the time the light began to go, the line of prisoners had stretched and sagged. Some walked with eyes half closed, guided more by the pressure of bodies on either side than by any conscious decision. James's legs moved because stopping meant falling, and falling meant a boot on the back and a single flat shot. When they finally saw the camp, it appeared first as a thin column of smoke rising against the darkening sky. Then the shapes of roofs emerged. Low, thatched structures crouched in a shallow valley, snow piled thick on their backs. A stone wall ringed the central space like a belt. From a distance, it might have looked almost peaceful. A winter village, the sort that might appear on a calendar. Up close, the cracks showed. The walls of the houses were split. Windows had been patched with paper and scraps of cloth. The few civilians James saw moved quickly, heads down, bodies tight, eyes flicking once toward the column of prisoners and then away, as if looking too long might bring attention. A child appeared in one doorway, a small face with wide, dark eyes. For a second, James saw simple curiosity there. Then a hand reached out from behind, grabbed the back of the child's shirt, and pulled him inside. The door closed. They were pushed through the wooden gate in the wall. It closed behind them with a sound that felt heavier than its actual weight. Inside, the yard was a rectangle of frozen mud. To one side stood a long, low building that smelled of old straw and animals, even from a distance. On the opposite side was another structure with its windows covered from within. The guards counted them again, forcing them into rough lines so that the numbers could be checked against whatever had been written at the ridge. One guard moved his finger down the column on his paper, lips moving. At the end, he hesitated, then wrote something. Whether the number matched the reality in front of him or not did not seem to matter. They were pushed into the barn. The air was thick with the smells of old manure and human breath. The floor was hard-packed earth. Straw had been scattered in rows along the walls, thin attempt at bedding. Men dropped onto it wherever there was space, ribs heaving, legs trembling in small twitches they could not control. James slid down until his back hit the rough planks. For a moment, he did not trust his own body to keep him upright. His wrists throbbed in time with his heartbeat. When someone came along the row and cut the wire from around them, the metal had frozen fast to his skin. It pulled free with a wet tearing sound. The pain was so bright, it washed the barn away for a second, turned everything into white light. He looked at his hands. The gloves were torn. Through the gaps, he could see grooves where the wire had bitten all the way through the outer layers of skin. Clear fluid seeped out, tinged pink. When it hit the air, it frosted, turning into a crust that glued the fabric to the wounds. He wanted to lie down. He wanted to let his body do whatever it was going to do. Sleep, shiver, stop. Do not go still. The voice came from his right, low, rough. The syllables shaped differently. British English, the kind that had sounded almost elegant in the films they had shown at the base theater. He turned his head. The man beside him wore a torn Commonwealth jacket. One sleeve was pinned neatly below the shoulder where an arm should have been. The empty fabric hung like a memory. His face was carved down by hunger, cheekbones sharp, eyes set deep. But those eyes were clear. "You freeze faster when you sit in one place," the man said. "Move, even a little. Keep the blood going." James looked at the floor, looked at his own legs. They felt like lengths of wood someone had tied to his hips. The idea of standing again made his ribs hurt in anticipation. He stood anyway. It was clumsy. His muscles protested in long, low waves of ache. His head swam for a second. The barn tilted and then steadied. He took one step, then another. He began to walk in a tight, awkward circle in the narrow space available to him, lifting his feet higher than he needed to, swinging his arms, feeling every motion tug at the torn skin of his wrists. The violent shivering that had been shaking him began slowly to ease. It did not stop. It changed. The wild, uncontrollable spasms became a constant, manageable tremor. His teeth still knocked together, but they no longer felt like they were trying to break themselves. Food came as if someone had remembered at the last minute that bodies needed fuel. A pot was brought in and set near the center of the barn. The contents were ladled into whatever containers appeared. The liquid was thin and milky, more water than rice. It tasted of smoke and metal and something faintly sour. James did not care. He tilted his helmet and let the warmth slide down his throat, feeling it hit his stomach and spread outward in a small, fragile wave. As darkness settled fully, the barn filled with the sounds of men trying to make uneasy peace with the fact that this was not where they had expected to be at the end of the day. Coughs racked thin chests. Someone muttered prayers in a language James did not know. Someone else, farther down the row, sobbed quietly, the sound muffled against his sleeve. The door opened again. The wind pushed a knife of cold into the room. Conversation stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. A single man stepped inside. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the worst of the wind. In the dim light, his outline was clear. He was not wrapped in the bulky padding of the Chinese uniforms. His jacket was darker, better cut. A cap with a red star sat on his head. His boots were cleaner. He moved down the central aisle between the rows of prisoners at a measured pace, hands behind his back, gaze sweeping. He did not need to raise his voice to own the room. Authority clung to him like a second coat. When he spoke, it was in Korean. Full sentences, complex structures. The language moved the way it had around James when he had been a child, listening from the doorway, as his parents spoke about things they did not want him to hear. Most of the men in the barn heard only sound. James heard words. Not all of them. Enough to understand that the man was talking about war and prisoners and duty and history. Enough to feel something inside him clench. He had spent years half forgetting that language, letting it slide into the spaces between English phrases. Now it came back in a rush that made him feel as if the ground had shifted under him. The officer's eyes moved along the rows, weighing, measuring. When they reached James, they paused. The gaze did not flick away. It held for a heartbeat longer than politeness required. There was no surprise in it, only confirmation. When the officer spoke again, his voice changed. The Korean dropped away. The English that replaced it was slower, careful, the way men spoke when they wanted to be sure every word landed. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You are alive because we did not kill you when you could not fight. You will be used. You will work. Some of you will go home when the war ends. Some of you will not. That is not cruelty. That is the mathematics of war." The words slid through the barn. Some men understood them, some did not. It hardly mattered. Tone carried more than meaning. The officer's gaze returned to James. "You," he said. "Corporal James Kim, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, United States Army." He pronounced the name the way older Korean relatives had always done when they first met James, with a tiny pause, as if testing the weight of each syllable. Hearing his unit designation spoken in that voice, in that accent, made something cold that had nothing to do with the wind settle in James's stomach. For this man to know those details about him meant that somewhere, someone had already turned his life into lines on a page in a language he could not read and filed it under a heading he had not chosen. The officer did not gesture. He did not need to. 2 guards stepped forward at a small tilt of his head. They reached down, took hold of James by the arms, and pulled him to his feet with a practiced efficiency. This time, their hands did not go to his neck. They did not reach for wire. They gripped him the way a man grips a tool he intends to use again. The camp did not announce that James had become useful. It simply began to behave as if he had. 3 mornings after the officer had spoken his name in that dim barn, the guards came for him again. They did not pull him up by the collar this time. They did not reach for wire. One hooked thick fingers into the back of his jacket and hauled him to his feet, but the grip was on cloth, not skin. When they pushed him toward the door, the muzzles of their rifles stayed low, angled more toward the general mass of prisoners than toward his spine. It was a small shift in posture. It felt like a fault line opening. Outside, the winter light was a flat, colorless smear across the yard. Snow had turned to a gray crust over churned mud. The air carried the smell of smoke from a cook fire somewhere beyond the wall, mingled with the sharper tang of latrines dug too shallow and used too often. A thin wind moved through the camp, sliding between the buildings like a knife looking for gaps in clothing. The camp, seen in full daylight, was not large. A handful of low Korean houses crouched in a shallow bowl of land, their thatched roofs humped under old snow. A stone wall encircled the central yard, waist high, more an idea of a barrier than a real one. Beyond it, bare hills rose toward a sky the color of bone. Leafless trees clung to the slopes, their black branches reaching upward like ribs. From the air, he thought, this place would register as a smudge, something a pilot might note in passing and forget before he reached the next ridge. Not worth a bomb, not worth a mark on a map. On the ground, it contained everything that now mattered: food, heat, pain, the thin lines between being alive and not. On one side of the yard stood the barn where the prisoners slept, its doors pulled shut against the wind, tendrils of breath and mutterings seeping through the gaps between boards. Opposite it was a building that had once been a village school. The windows were covered from within with paper and cloth, but faint light still leaked around the edges. A faint, steady hum of sound came from inside. Low voices, occasional groans, the muffled, metallic clatter of instruments. The guards pushed him toward that door. They called the place a hospital in the language they had learned from their Soviet advisors, a foreign word awkward in their mouths. Lazaret. It sounded too clean for what waited behind that door, too clinical. The first time James stepped into that room as something other than a patient, the air hit him with almost physical force. The heat was heavier than in the barn, not because the room was warm, but because so many sick bodies were packed into it that the cold had been pushed back a few inches. The smell was a layered thing. Old sweat soaked into blankets, boiled cloth, the sour tang of unwashed skin, the metallic sweetness of blood that had dried in place and been half cleaned away. Underneath it all, like a faint, rotten thread, the sick, sweet odor of infection. Bodies lay on wooden pallets along both walls, crowded so close that a man sitting up would brush the knees of the man across the narrow aisle. Blankets, uniforms, coats, anything that could be spared had been piled over them in uneven layers. Some faces were visible, some were turned to the wall, some were buried under fabric as if hiding from the air itself. There were Americans there, British, South Koreans, a few Turkish soldiers whose uniforms looked out of place in this valley. The colors and cuts that had meant something on the line had been reduced now to patches of fabric stretched over the same sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. At the far end of the room, under a window covered in paper that turned the light thin and gray, a table had been set up. It was a kitchen table stolen from one of the village houses, its surface worn smooth by years of family meals. Now it held gauze, bottles, a stack of cloth bandages boiled and reboiled until they were more stain than fiber. The Korean doctor stood beside it, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands bare. His white coat had been washed so many times that it had gone translucent along the creases. The skin under his eyes was dark and bruised-looking. His hair had more gray in it than black. His back was straight with the stiffness of someone who had been taught once that posture meant seriousness and had never quite unlearned it. He did not look up when they brought James in. He finished tying a bandage around the thigh of a man whose leg had been opened from hip to knee and closed again with stitches so large they looked like work done by a butcher using heavy string. Only when he had tucked the final knot did he wipe his hands on a cloth and turn. His gaze moved over James in a slow, measuring sweep, not hostile, not welcoming. Assessing the way a man looked at a tool he had not seen before and was deciding whether it would hold up to use. "You speak English," he said in his own language. The words landed in James' chest with a thud. Hearing Korean in full sentences still felt like being knocked off balance. "Yes," James answered, in Korean that tasted rusty on his tongue. "Enough to understand their sickness." "Yes." The doctor nodded once toward the nearest row of pallets. "Ask who hurts most. Ask who cannot wait. Tell me. There is medicine for a few, bandages for some, nothing for the rest." There was no hardness in his tone when he said it. No apology either, just the flat weariness of someone who had been living in arithmetic like that for too long. James walked to the first pallet. The man lying there was from his own unit, though it took a moment for the face to resolve itself into memory. Swelling had distorted his features, turned his ankle into an obscene bulge under the blanket. The skin of the joint was stretched shiny and mottled red and purple. Heat rolled off it, enough that James could feel it through the cold in his fingers. He crouched, asked the questions that training had taught him. How long had it been like this? Did it hurt even when he did not move? Had he been cold? Had he shaken with chills? The answers came in a voice that tried to sound brave and fell short. The pain had been there for days. It was worse now. Yes, there had been chills. Yes, he had started to feel sick all over, not just in the leg. At each pallet, he repeated the pattern. Questions. Answers. He described the symptoms to the doctor in Korean, stumbling over some of the medical terms, finding others more easily than he expected. The doctor listened with his arms folded across his chest, eyes flicking from James' face to the wounded men, and back, weighing. It took 4 pallets for James to understand that he had stepped into a different kind of fire. On the line, a man might die because a bullet found him instead of the man next to him, because a mortar landed where it landed. There was no choice in it. Here, choice was everywhere. Every answer he translated, every detail he included or forgot, tipped the scales. There were men with bullet wounds that might be survivable if infection was held off. There were men whose lungs rattled like paper bags, whose breaths came in shallow gasps, whose lips had a bluish tinge that had nothing to do with the cold. There were feet that had turned an ugly, lifeless white, then a blotchy purple, then black at the tips, the skin hard as wood. In a different place, with different supplies, someone might have been able to save them. Here, everything came down to what was in a single wooden box on the table. When James had made his way back down the row and finished describing what he had seen, the doctor opened that box. Inside, nestled in straw that had been carefully dried, were glass vials. The liquid in them was the color of weak tea, penicillin. James knew what it was because he had watched it used in American aid stations. He had seen it hung in bottles above cots, clear lines running into the arms of men who had been white with fever one day and were sitting up the next, joking weakly with nurses. He had heard in training about how it had changed the way war medicine worked, how cuts and infections that would have killed a man in earlier wars could now be treated, turned into footnotes instead of endings. In the field hospitals he had passed through on his way north, there had been entire cabinets full of those vials. Nurses had moved among them with the casual efficiency of people who trusted that when they reached for more, they would be there. In this box, there were 6. The doctor took 3 out and set them on the table. He weighed them in his hands for a moment, as if grains of powder and drops of liquid could be measured like gilt. "The man with metal in his stomach," he said. "Young, strong. Without this, he dies today. With it, he may not." He set the first vial aside. "The one whose lungs are full," he continued. "He may live even without it, if he has luck. With it, he has more luck." The second vial joined the first. The one with the ankle, the doctor said, "The infection is in the limb. We can cut. If we cut, he lives without this." He looked at James. "We do not waste medicine where a knife can do the same work." He put the third vial back in the box. "You will tell him," the doctor said. "There will be no medicine for him. There will be a knife. He will live if he is strong." The words landed in James like a stone. He walked back to the pallet. The private, whose name finally came to him now that they were face to face, was watching him with the tight, hopeful expression of a man who knows that strangers are making choices about his body and is trying not to beg. "Well," the private said, "Doc going to fix me up?" The accent was threaded with the softness of someone from the South, somewhere with more trees than concrete. His teeth chattered once as he forced a grin. There were a dozen ways James could have answered. He could have repeated the doctor's words as they had been said. No medicine, knife. The logic laid bare. He could have softened them, wrapped them in long explanations about shortages and triage and numbers on a page. In the end, what came out was simple. "They are going to operate," he said. "They do not have enough medicine for everyone. They think you are strong enough to live without it. That is why they chose you." The sentence sat between them, balanced on the point where truth and lie met. It was not false. It was not clean either. The private swallowed. His eyes shone briefly and then steadied. "If I make it," he said, "you tell them I will come back and kick their asses in a year." He tried to laugh at the end of it. The sound turned into a hiss as a spasm of pain grabbed his leg. James did not translate that last line. The doctor was already boiling instruments in a dented pot on a small stove. A guard moved to hold the private's shoulders. Another took his leg. There was no anesthetic strong enough to wipe this out. There was only a rag between his teeth and the hope that he would faint fast. That was the first day James understood that in this place, mercy had to be measured, counted, rationed. That being the one who carried words between the sick and the man with the box made him part of that calculation, whether he wanted it or not. The days that followed began to form a rhythm that was nothing like the steady patterns of barracks life, but was a rhythm all the same. At dawn, a whistle shrilled in the yard. Men stumbled out of the barn for roll call, breath smoking in the air that turned lashes into brittle white spikes. Guards moved along the ranks, counting, sometimes hitting, sometimes not. A pot of thin rice appeared, a bucket of water. The food was barely enough to be called a meal, but it drew a faint line between one day and the next. By mid-morning, someone would jerk his head toward the schoolhouse. James would go. In the lazaret, he translated pain into symptoms, symptoms into decisions, decisions into action that often meant more pain. On some days, the doctor opened the box and found nothing left in it. On those days, his hands moved slower. He cleaned wounds, changed bandages, offered instructions instead of injections. Keep this one warm. Raise this one's head. Give this one water a mouthful at a time, or he will choke. James carried those instructions back to the barn, repeated them in English, watched the men for whom they were meant try to follow them in a space where there were not enough blankets, not enough hands, not enough hours. In the evenings, he sometimes found himself in the officer's room. It had once been a classroom. The blackboard still hung on one wall. Now the chalk marks were diagrams of supply routes and lines of advance instead of arithmetic and letters. The officer sat behind a desk that had been built for a teacher, a notebook open in front of him. The questions he asked were not shouted accusations. They were calm, steady inquiries. Where had a man worked before the war? What machines had he known how to fix? What languages could he understand? Had he been to Asia before? What had he been told about this war? When prisoners refused to answer, when they recited name and rank and serial number like a catechism, the officer did not leap to his feet or reach for a weapon. He simply watched them, eyes steady, and waited for the silence to stretch. Sometimes that was worse. Silence in that room became a presence of its own, pressing on the ears until someone broke just to make it stop. James' voice moved back and forth between languages until there were times he was no longer sure which one he had used last. He learned quickly that tone mattered as much as the words themselves. A trace of sympathy could change how a prisoner looked at him. A hint of eagerness could alter the way the officer's gaze rested on his face. In the barn at first, the others watched him with the mix of curiosity and relief men show to someone who has been singled out but is still sleeping on the same straw. When he came back from the lazaret with a scrap of extra bandage, an old shirt torn into strips, a small hoarded piece of bread the doctor had pressed into his hand with the practical remark that a translator who collapsed was useless, he shared it. A corner for the man coughing himself raw near the door. A strip for the Turkish soldier whose wound had started to leak through the dirty wrapping. A swallow of water pressed to the lips of someone whose tongue had turned dry and cracked. That bought him something for a while. A little trust, a little space. One evening, after a long day in which the doctor had cut, stitched, and bound until his hands shook, James slid into his usual place along the back wall. The British sergeant with the missing arm who had told him on that first night not to go still shifted closer. "You were in there a long time today," the sergeant said, his voice a low scrape. "There were many wounded," James answered. "They give you anything for it," the sergeant said. "Food, blanket, cigarette." James thought of the thin bowl of extra soup the doctor had pushed toward him at midday, with the tired comment that a man could not empty the sick if he had nothing in him. He thought of the way one guard had flicked him a broken cigarette in the yard, the gesture half testing, half something else. "Sometimes," James said. "You share," the sergeant said. It was not a question. It was a line. "Yes," James said. The sergeant nodded once. "Then you are still with us," he said. The words landed with a weight that felt almost as heavy as the doctor's had when he had opened the box. Not everyone agreed with that assessment. It happened in small ways at first. A man who had once shifted over to make room on the straw for him now kept his back turned and his elbows out. A joke that would once have been flung across the barn in a tired voice died on someone's tongue when James came within earshot. A cough that sounded like a word he did not want to hear when spoken in his direction. On a morning when the frost had painted the inside of the barn walls as well as the outside, he reached for his canteen and found that it was warm to the touch. Warmer than it had any right to be in that air. He unscrewed the cap, lifted it, smelled. Ammonia. His throat closed. No one looked at him directly. No one claimed it. No one had to. The message was clear enough. "You carry their words," it said. "Drink what they give you." He took the canteen outside, poured it out onto the frozen ground, watched the steam rise. When he came back in, the British sergeant was watching him. "You should have drunk it," the sergeant said quietly. "They will do worse now. Men in cages look for ways to hurt the one who moves between the bars." James did not answer. He did not trust his voice. The worst blow did not come from the prisoners. It came from the officer. One afternoon, when the sky had gone the heavy low shade that meant more snow was on its way, a guard appeared in the lazaret and jerked his head toward the door. The doctor waved James away with a hand without looking up from the wound he was stitching. There was always more blood, always another edge of skin to pull together. The officer's room was colder than the lazaret. A small stove in the corner gave off more smoke than heat. On the desk lay a folded newspaper, its front covered with dense columns of Korean script. Beside it was a photograph, grainy black and white, clipped neatly from another page. The photograph showed men in American uniforms sitting at a long table. Their shoulders were slumped. Their faces had the drawn look of men who had not slept. Behind them, on the wall, hung a banner with words in Korean and English. The English letters were large enough even in the poor print for James to read. Crimes of American imperialists exposed. Underneath, a caption in English said simply, "American prisoners confess to war crimes." The officer watched him take it in. "They will ask some of your pilots to do this," he said. "They will give them words to say. They will ask you to carry those words to them, to make sure they understand." "I will not translate lies," James said. The officer's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "You will translate their words," he said. "Whether those words are lies or not is between them and whatever they believe in when they close their eyes at night." He opened a drawer in the desk and took out a sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The paper was thin and cheap, the kind used in ration offices. The handwriting on it was careful, the loops and lines formed by someone who did not trust herself not to make a mistake. Even before the officer unfolded it, James knew what it was. He knew it from the way his throat closed, from the way his heart began to hammer fast and hard against his ribs. The officer held the letter delicately, as if it were something fragile. "Your mother writes good English," he said, in Korean, each word slow and precise. "She asks if anyone has seen you. She sent this to the foreign organizations that collect such questions. They sent it to us instead." He read a line from it aloud in English, his accent flattening the vowels but leaving the meaning intact. She wrote that her son was last heard from near the river. She wrote that he is a good boy. She wrote that she hopes, if he is a prisoner, someone will be kind. The words punched the air out of James's lungs harder than the mortar blast had. The officer folded the letter again and tucked it back into the drawer. "Whether she learns that you are alive," he said, "depends on how useful you are here. Whether she learns how you are alive depends on what you do." He looked up. "You are a bridge, Corporal Kim," he said. "You can carry words from one side to the other. Bridges can be used to move many things: people, ideas, lies, truth. They can also be blown up." James saw in that moment not the map the officer had drawn on the blackboard of supply routes and front lines, but a narrow strip of yard between a barn and a schoolhouse. A path he walked every day, straw underfoot at one end, blood-stained boards at the other, men on both sides watching him go. That night, back in the barn, as the wind pushed fine snow through every gap in the boards and men coughed in the dark, the British sergeant spoke into the space between them without turning his head. "They are using you," he said. "Yes," James said. "We are using you too," the sergeant said. "When we shove the dying in front of you, when we beg you to get the doctor, when we ask you who will be seen first, you are the only piece that moves, so everyone moves you." James stared up at the shadowed rafters. "I do not think there is a side for me any more," he said. The sergeant made a small, tired sound that might have been a laugh. "Then you will have to stand in the space between," he said, "and try to hold it, even if it tears you open." Out in the yard, snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering tracks as if they had never been there. James stopped counting days the moment the calendar in his head turned into a list of bodies. For a while, at the beginning, he had tried to keep track. The first week after the ridge, the second week after the wire, the day the last vial in the box was used, the day the frostbite on his fingers turned from a threat into fact. He had 3 fingers on his left hand that no longer belonged to him in any useful way. They were black from the second knuckle down, hard and small, like pieces of burned wood glued to his palm. When he tapped them against the floor at night, he felt nothing. Winter ground itself into the camp with the slow, grinding patience of a machine. Snow fell, melted into mud under boots, froze again. The wind found every gap between boards, every tear in cloth. Men shrank. Their uniforms, which had been snug when they arrived, began to hang off them in tired folds. Faces hollowed out. Eyes seemed to grow larger because everything around them was narrowing. James moved each day along the same thin strip of yard between the barn and the schoolhouse. straw underfoot at one end, blood-stained planks at the other. Between them lay his job. In the mornings, roll call and thin rice, and the brief animal scramble for space near the pot. Then the lazarette, where he translated moans into symptoms and symptoms into decisions. In the evenings, the officer's room, where he translated questions into pressure, and pressure into small, grinding shifts inside the men who sat on the other side of the desk. The wire scars on his wrists had stopped bleeding, but they had not stopped speaking. The grooves had thickened into ropey ridges of scar tissue that pulled when he flexed his hands. In the cold, they went numb. When they warmed even slightly near the stove in the officer's room, or over a pan of boiled instruments in the lazarette, they burned in a deep, bone-deep way that felt like the metal was still there, buried under the skin. The camp itself began to behave as if he were part of its structure. Guards no longer needed to be told to fetch him. When they wanted something explained, they simply jerked their heads in his direction. When a new group of prisoners arrived one gray morning, captured in some other valley he had never seen, the officer did not bother to introduce James. He simply had the guards push the new men into the yard, and then nodded at James as if to say, "Make their words useful." Among the new arrivals was a man James recognized even before he saw his face. The way he held his shoulders as if trying to make himself broader than he was, the set of his jaw, the slight limp in his left leg, a souvenir from a training accident that had never quite healed. Sergeant Miller from Baker Company. Back on the ridge, Miller had been the one who had laughed the loudest at the briefings, not because he found them funny, but because his laugh was his way of saying to the men around him that he would stand between them and the worst of whatever was coming. He had been the one who had tossed James a cigarette on the march north and said, in a tone that brooked no argument, that a man who could speak 2 languages had no business being in a foxhole when there were officers who might need him elsewhere. Now his face was a mottled map of purple and yellow. One eye was swollen shut. Crusted blood sat under his nose. His lips were split. He walked under his own power, but each step seemed to cost. The officer watched the new prisoners from the classroom doorway, arms folded. When his gaze reached Miller, he tilted his head slightly. "This one," he said in Korean. "He does not answer questions. He thinks that saying the same numbers over and over makes him strong." He spoke the numbers aloud in English, in a flat mimicry of the way Miller must have said them. Name, rank, serial. "We will see how strong he is," the officer said. Later that day, they brought Miller into the lazarette, not as a patient, as an example. He stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly, hands tied behind his back with rope. His good eye was bright with a light that was not fever. He saw James, and something in his face tightened. "You," Miller said. His voice was rough. It grated in his throat. "Of course they would have you here." The doctor stood by the table, arms folded. The guards flanked Miller, their rifles held casually, barrels pointed at the floor. "The sergeant," the officer said, "tried to teach my men that he does not have to listen, that your rules are more important than my questions. That is not acceptable. I want you to explain that to him in a way he understands." James looked from the officer to Miller. The world seemed to narrow around the space between them. "What do you want me to say?" he asked in English, because he could not bring himself to put this question into Korean. "That if he continues to refuse, we will make sure he cannot speak at all," the officer said. "And that when that happens, the men in the barn will know it is because he tried to be a hero for them in the wrong way." James translated. The words felt like shards in his mouth. Miller listened, head tilted slightly, as if he were trying to catch a distant sound. "Tell him," the officer added, "that his mother has not written to us. Perhaps she does not know how. Perhaps she does not care. Your mother writes good letters. His does not. There is a difference." James did not translate that. He let it sit in the air, unspoken, like a trap that had been set and then left unused. Miller smiled. It was a wrecked thing, full of blood and defiance. "You tell him," Miller said, "that I do not talk to men who hide behind other men's mouths. If he wants to hear me scream, he can do his own work." James did not translate that exactly. He softened it, stripped it of the insult, turned it into a simple refusal. The officer was not fooled. His gaze sharpened for a moment where it rested on James, then slid back to Miller. "Very well," he said. He gave a small nod. One of the guards stepped behind Miller, took hold of his hair, and yanked his head back. The other guard raised his rifle by the barrel. The first blow landed across Miller's mouth. Teeth broke under it. James heard the crunch, a sound like someone stepping on dry twigs. Blood sprayed, dark against the pale boards of the floor. Miller made a sound that was not a word, not a scream. Something raw and animal that seemed pulled from somewhere too deep to have a name. The second blow took him in the ribs. There was another crack, deeper. His legs buckled, but the guard behind him held him up by his hair, stretching his neck until the skin at his throat went tight and pale. The doctor did not move. His face had gone very still. His hands hung at his sides. "Tell him," the officer said, in an almost conversational tone, "that the more he refuses, the less medicine there will be in this room tomorrow." James stood frozen. The blows kept coming. Arms, back, ribs. Each impact left a new bruise already rising under the skin. Somewhere under the hammering of wood on bone, he heard something else. A wet, bubbling sound when Miller tried to breathe. A high, breathless whine that did not belong to a grown man and yet was coming from his chest. It ended not because anyone showed mercy, but because Miller's legs finally gave way in a way even the guard behind him could not counter. His body slid down out of the man's grip and hit the floor flat. For a second, he lay on his back, eyes open, lungs fighting for air. Then his head rolled to the side. Blood poured from his mouth in a steady stream, pooling under his cheek. The officer watched him for a moment. "Enough for today," he said. "If he cannot answer tomorrow, we will find another example." He turned to James. "You will write a report," he said, in Korean. "You will say that the injuries are consistent with resistance during capture, that they happen on the ridge, that they were not our doing." He looked at James with a calm expression. "If you do that," he said, "the men on those pallets may see medicine again. If you do not, the box stays closed." The doctor said nothing. His eyes flicked from James to the box of penicillin on the table and back. James felt the room tilt. The air seemed too thick. His hands shook when he picked up the pen. The report, when he wrote it, was short. One paragraph. Plain language. No flourishes. He stated that Sergeant Miller had sustained facial and rib injuries in combat, resisting capture. He signed his name at the bottom, each letter a weight. When he looked up, Miller was watching him through the one eye that was not swollen shut. Blood leaked from the corner of his mouth. His teeth were pink where they had not been broken. "You did it," Miller said in a voice that sounded like it was coming through cloth. "You really did it." James could not answer. He set the pen down. The officer took the paper, folded it neatly, and slid it into a folder with other papers that would make other things tidy. They carried Miller back to the barn that night. 2 men took his shoulders. One grabbed his feet. His body hung between them, limp, head lolling. His boots left smears on the floor where they dragged. James walked behind them because the guards had told him to, because the officer had nodded, because he did not know how not to. In the barn, they laid Miller on a strip of straw near the back wall. The British sergeant shifted aside to make room, jaw tight. Men clustered for a moment, then drifted back to their own places. No one wanted to be too close to whatever this was. Miller's breathing sounded wrong. Each inhale scraped. Each exhale bubbled. His chest rose in shallow jerks. Blood had dried on his lips in a crust that cracked when he tried to speak. "You could have said no," he whispered when James crouched beside him. "You could have let him do his own lying." "If I had," James said, because there was no point in pretending now. The doctor would have had nothing tomorrow. The box would have stayed closed. Miller's good eye focused on him with an effort. "So you took my teeth," he said, "so they could give someone else a shot." He tried to laugh. The sound collapsed into a fit of coughing. Red flecks sprayed onto James's jacket. For a moment, Miller's hand groped blindly and closed on James's sleeve. His fingers were sticky. His grip was weak. "You remember this," Miller said. "When you go home, if you go home, you remember whose bones you traded for that bottle." His hand slipped away. His head rolled back. His eye stayed fixed on the ceiling. James sat there long after Miller's breath had settled into a harsh, irregular rasp that might carry through the night or might not. He felt the gaze of the other prisoners along his spine. Some were hostile. Some were simply tired. All of them understood now that his voice could reach into rooms where their bodies could not go. The next morning, the box on the table in the lazaret was open. There were 3 new vials in it. The doctor did not comment. He simply nodded at James to begin. By midday, he had watched those vials turn into chances. One went into the arm of a South Korean soldier whose leg wound had started to stink in a way that meant something inside was rotting. One dripped into the veins of the Turkish private who had been coughing up pink foam. The third went to a boy from his own regiment who had developed a red streak running up his arm from a small cut he had gotten days earlier, a line that had been crawling toward his heart. Each time he translated the explanation, each time he watched the needle go in, he saw Miller on the floor, heard teeth breaking under wood, heard the wet crack in ribs. In the officer's room that evening, the newspaper lay on the desk again. The same photograph of American pilots sat under the same headline. The officer tapped it with one finger. "We will do something like this here," he said. "Soon. We will have your pilots sit at a table. We will have them speak about what they have seen, about what your country has done. The world will listen." He looked at James with an expression that might have been almost kind under other circumstances. "They will need help," he said. "Their English is good, but they will be tired. They will be afraid. You will make sure they say the words correctly." "They will not say them freely," James said. The officer shrugged. "No one says anything freely," he said. "You know that better than most now. You sign paper. He loses teeth. They get medicine. That is a chain. Words are links." That night, the air in the barn was thick with something heavier than smoke. Miller lay where they had left him. His face had swollen further. His chest rose and fell, like someone had put a weight on it, and it was trying to push back. At some point in the dark, the harsh rasp of his breathing stopped. No one said anything at first. Then the British sergeant sat up, swung his legs over the side of the straw, and reached for the blanket covering Miller. He pulled it up over the sergeant's face with one arm. The gesture was precise, almost gentle. "He is done," the sergeant said. "We are not." In the morning, 2 guards came to drag the body out. When they lifted him, his head fell back at an angle that said clearly which bones had broken. A smear of dried blood remained on the straw where his mouth had been. Someone dropped another handful of straw over it, as if that could make it less visible. After they took him away, James sat with his back against the wall and looked at the space Miller had occupied. The barn smelled of unwashed bodies and cold earth, and grief pressed down under anger. A whisper moved through the straw, quiet and sharp. "Collaborator." The word did not need a name attached to it. Everyone knew who it meant. It landed on James's skin and crawled there, looking for a way in. He went to the lazaret when the guard jerked his head because he did not know what else to do. He asked who hurt most. He told the doctor. He watched the box open and close. He carried instructions back to men who would not meet his eyes. At the end of the day, when he stood again in the officer's room, the blackboard behind the desk held a new set of chalk lines. It was not a map this time. It was a schedule. On one side, times. On the other, names. Next to a slot 3 days from now, the officer had written, in blocky English, the word pilot. "We will begin soon," the officer said. "You should think about how you will sound when you ask him to speak." He picked up a rag and wiped a corner of the board, clearing space. "Bridges do not choose what crosses them," he said. "They only decide how long they stand before they break." That night, as James lay on the hard floor of the barn, he stared into the dark and tried to imagine a version of himself who had never stepped onto that strip of yard between the 2 buildings. A version who had died on the ridge with a rifle in his hands, his mother's postcard over his heart, and no broken teeth weighing on his conscience. That version felt farther away with each breath. Outside, snow fell again, soft and relentless, covering footprints and blood alike until the yard looked clean.